As Chris mentioned earlier, the book of Judges has some crazy things that happen in it. I'm not sure the exact word that Chris used, but I think crazy is a very tame word that we can use. We're going to be in Judges chapter 10, 11, and 12 today, looking at the story of Jephthah. Now, as we go throughout the book of Judges, we see that the people are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. They're getting further and further and further away from God, and it's just not good. And so we find in Judges chapter 10, starting in verse 6, again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. They served the images of Baal and Ashtoreth and the gods of Aram, Sidon, Moab, Ammon, and Philistia. They abandoned the Lord and no longer served him at all. So the Lord burned with anger against Israel, and he turned them over to the Philistines and the Ammonites, who began to oppress them that year. For 18 years, they oppressed all the Israelites east of the Jordan River in the land of the Amorites, that is, in Gilead. The Ammonites crossed over the west side of the Jordan and attacked Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim. The Israelites were in great distress. Finally, they cried out to the Lord for help. Continuing in verse 14, the Lord said, "Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them rescue you in your hour of distress." But the Israelites pleaded with the Lord and said, "We have sinned. Punish us as you see fit. Only rescue us today from our enemies." Then the Israelites put aside their foreign gods and served the Lord. And he was grieved by their misery. At that time, the armies of Ammon gathered for war and were camped in Gilead, and the people of Israel assembled and camped at Mizpah. The leaders of Gilead said to each other, "Whoever attacks the Ammonites first will become ruler over all the people of Gilead." And so we see there's another cycle has happened. Israel has sinned, and God has turned them over to their enemies, and then they cry out to the Lord for help, and then we see God's response. They serve the gods of Aram, Sidon, Moab, Ammon, and Philistia. And so I think it's interesting when we talk about there's 5 different areas located there, the gods of 5 different people groups. And as we think of that, it brings me to the conclusion that this was not just a slip-up. It's not like they accidentally sinned or accidentally did something contrary to God. You know, there are 5 different deity groups that they begin to worship. This was an intentional decision that had become embedded in their society. This was normal for them. This was not something that was just a passing temptation. It was not a one-time slip-up. It was a conscious decision. And the thing about idolatry is that it leads to slavery. But one of the things we see throughout the book of Judges, and it continues in this story, is that dysfunctional decisions deliver destruction. They are in a bad spot. And I said that idolatry leads to slavery, but really, what we worship controls us. Good or bad, what we worship controls us. If we worship our family, our jobs, our careers, a sports team, it controls us. If you worship a sports team and they don't do well, that affects you. You know, some people like that. Like those, whatever we worship controls us. And so we think of the fact that we worship God. We say Yahweh from the Old Testament, worship Jesus. We remember in Matthew chapter 11, Jesus tells us, he says, "My yoke is easy." Jesus is not our God to be our controller in a way that makes life difficult for us. Jesus' purpose is not to make your life more difficult. In fact, the commands that Jesus gives us are to free us from the burden of sin. And so we worship Jesus, and Jesus controls us, but Jesus, his mission for us in our lives is not for us to live miserable lives. He's calling us to live the best life. But all these other deities that we worship are trying to get things from us and milk us for all we are. So what we worship controls us, and we can choose. And Israel, after 18 years, finally realized this was a bad choice. And so they cry out to the Lord. Remember, in the book of Judges, when they cry out to the Lord, this is not a sign of repentance. It's a, "Hey, we got caught. Can you get rid of the consequences?" Right, we've all been there. We've all done that. And this is the standard part of the cycle of Judges. But we see that God's patience has kind of waned a little bit. Israel at this point has experienced over 50 years of oppression. From Othniel all the way up to this point, we see that Israel has been oppressed by the enemies for over 50 years, and they still haven't learned. They still keep making the same choice. But through the book of Judges, they get worse and worse and worse, and their spiritual health is getting worse and worse. And there are a lot of subtle clues that the stories tell us about how Israel is getting worse. And the fact that the enemies attacked Ephraim, Benjamin, and Judah is pretty significant. Now, Benjamin was kind of just thrown in there a little bit, but Judah and Ephraim were by far the two strongest tribes of Israel. There were 12 tribes, and Judah and Ephraim were kind of the big dogs. When there was a fight, you wanted those two to help you. And we see that the enemy is they're just not attacking the weaklings. They're just not getting the sick or those that are exposed. They're going to the heart of Israel. They're going to the strength. They're going to Judah, and they're going to Ephraim. And we see that their spiritual health and their political health and their strength in general has gone down. So God's patience has begun to wane, and he rebukes Israel and says, hey, cry out to those gods that you're serving. You've chosen them. You've made your bed. Now sleep in it. So there's tension here between God's holiness and his mercy and grace. And we see that God's holiness and his justice has these, God cannot tolerate sin, but yet God loves us and wants the best for us. But that doesn't mean he excuses poor behavior. And so we see that God is having a tension moment here. He said, hey, if that's what you want, go to them. See, Israel knows that without God's deliverance, they are doomed. And at the same time, God knows that Israel's repentance is temporary. That they're not sorry they did it, they're sorry they got caught. And that is the problem with what Israel is doing. And we do this. Right? We love the phrase, I'm going to ask for forgiveness, not permission. Right? We've done that many times. And if you haven't, you probably haven't evaluated your life very closely. We do that in our world. I probably shouldn't, but I'm going to. I'm going to ask for forgiveness instead of permission. And so God and Israel is having a moment. But God's people, they say, we're going to accept the consequences. Whatever punishment you think we deserve, just give it to us. Because God had sold Israel, or turned them over to the enemies. Now, we have to be careful when we think about that, because it's not as though God was being vindictive and saying, well, I'm going to just put you in a terrible spot. It was Israel had rejected God. And so they had rejected his protection, rejected his power in their life. So they pushed him away, which means that they were exposed to their enemies. But we recognize sin has consequences. And sometimes God can come into our life and get rid of those consequences in a way that has no residual effects. But there are other times where there's still effects of sin. I think one of the tangible ways I really think of this is if somebody was a 2-pack-a-day smoker for 30 years, the first day they stopped, they still had black lungs. Right? Sometimes we have sin, so we can be free from whatever that sinful behavior is. Somebody who smokes can be free from the addiction to nicotine, but they still have consequences from their past actions. And sometimes our sin has consequences, not as though God's forgiveness is lacking, but there's a reality in the world that we live that happens because of what sin did. We think of choices we make cause consequences, and God can forgive us and redeem us and restore us, but we can't always pretend like it didn't happen. But what Israel did is they put aside their idolatrous ways. They said, we're not sure if God's going to forgive us, because when God said serve those gods, go to them, they decided to get rid of that idolatry, and then God stepped in. But then we see Ammon gathers for war, and we have this battle that is getting ready to come about. But sometimes what happens in our society as a whole, but also within the church, is that it's really easy to make promises to God when we want something. God, if you do this, I will do that. If you provide here, I will change this behavior or this mentality. And honestly, that's a dysfunctional decision. That's a dysfunctional way to live our spiritual lives. And dysfunctional decisions deliver destruction, bring bad things. And we find Jephthah really does that. Because we come to chapter 11 and we find Jephthah. Now, chapter 11 has a lot of details about Jephthah. Essentially, he was the son of, most texts say, a prostitute. But really, he was the son of Gilead and another woman. See, the text is ambiguous. It could have been an affair, extramarital relationship on some level, but money didn't necessarily change hands with the actual word that was being used. But regardless of what it really means, we find that Jephthah was not on the same social level as the rest of his brothers. All of his other brothers essentially kicked him out and said, we don't want to share our inheritance with you. And so he got kicked out of the family. But Jephthah didn't just go and have a pity party. We find that Jephthah was a very capable individual. He was a mighty warrior. He also had some level of charisma because he had a band of people that came with him. And depending on your version, some say rebels, some say worthless individuals. So I thought that was an interesting translation. But really, they're idle. And this word means to make empty, or they're looking for something to do. You know, when you're bored, that's when you get into trouble a lot of times. Right? These men that Jephthah had essentially recruited had nothing better to do, and so they got into trouble. Now, we don't have any of their exploits listed or what they actually did, but my point is that Jephthah was a very skilled leader. He was a gifted warrior, and he had people that were willing to follow him. Israel, on the other hand, had a lot of soldiers, but they didn't have a leader. Ammon had gathered for battle. Israel was gathering for battle, but Israel didn't have the person who could actually lead the men into battle. And so they go to Jephthah and they say, be our leader. Now, Jephthah's not dumb. It's like, you guys kicked me out. You exiled. You shoved me to the curb. You got rid of me. Why should I do this? And they said, well, if you lead our warriors, our soldiers, then we'll make you our leader. And so they had a back and forth. And really, there's a lot of similarities between the conversation between Jephthah and the men of Gilead and the men of Israel or the people of Israel and God. Because when Israel cried out to God, God said, hey, go serve the gods that you've chosen. When Gilead talked to Jephthah, he says, hey, you didn't want me. You didn't want me in the first place. And then they come back to God, and God says, finally changes and relents and becomes to their deliverance. And Jephthah changes, says, if you let me be your ruler, then I will actually lead these people. But Jephthah is very clear in how he goes about it. And he makes them covenant, makes them commit in a very public setting. It wasn't one of those things where he just had a handshake agreement. He had a very public agreement so other people would know that he was their leader. Jephthah was alienated. He was exiled, and he claimed that the people of Gilead hated him. Now, hate in this moment is a covenantal term. Because what he's getting at is he's telling the people of Gilead, says, I have no obligation to you. There is no reason that I should have to do this. The only reason I would do this is because it's out of the kindness of my own heart. And so on that level, we see that Jephthah has some similarities to God. There was nothing that would force God to actually care for these people that had rejected him. Now with Jephthah, we don't always know all the nuances or the underlining meaning between what people are doing or not doing in Scripture. But we have other things that we can pull from. And we get to the book of Hebrews, close to the end of the New Testament, and it talks about Jephthah was a man of faith. And so we see that there were some redeeming qualities about him. He was not somebody who was just using the situation to a political advantage. By using this covenantal term with the word hate, he's changing it from a political situation to a spiritual moment. And so he's shifting it and making it more spiritual than it is politically. So we have the question, is Jephthah an opportunist, or is he faithful to God? And if I was going to choose, I would say he's being faithful to God, particularly with how he's portrayed in Hebrews and the language that he's using here. But again, we can't always know 100% what was happening there. But he shows leadership. He shows leadership by how he interacts with the people of Gilead, but he also shows leadership with how he acts with the enemy. Because Ammon had gathered for battle, and Israel was getting ready to gather for battle, and the first thing that Jephthah did is he sent some messages to Ammon to essentially appeal for peace. And there's some back and forth, and what we find is that Jephthah is a warrior, a gifted leader, but he also knows the horrors of war. That if war can be avoided, that's probably the best case scenario. But what he does in his conversation with Ammon is he sets the record straight. Ammon had justified this war by saying Israel had stolen their rightful property. Israel had taken land from Ammon, and they were wanting it back. And Jephthah said, whoa, whoa, whoa. No, that's not even close to what happened. Because 300 years earlier, Israel was a wandering people in the desert on their way to the promised land, and they came to a couple places, and they asked the kings of those places, hey, can we go through? And the king said no. The king of Edom, the king of Moab said no. And so they get to King Shishon and of Ammon, and he says no, but then he attacks Israel, and Israel wins the battle and takes over the land. And so what Jephthah is saying is, we didn't start this fight. You're the ones who started this fight. But the problem with war is that both sides have to justify to their constituents as to why they are going to war. If no one believes in the reason for why the war happens, that's a huge problem. It's likely not going to be successful. We've seen examples of that through history, how things get heated because there's a debate over whether this war should happen or not. So both sides are trying to justify why this battle is happening. And Jephthah gets to the point, he says, God has given us this land. This is Yahweh has given us this land. Why would we give it back? And then he kind of has a little sucker punch to him. He says, well, if your God, Chemosh, really wants you to have this land, just trust him to give it to you. We're going to trust our God and you trust your God. Is really where it ends, and nothing is settled. So they're going to go to war. But in verse 29 of chapter 11, we see at that time the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he went throughout the land of Gilead and Manasseh, including Mizpah in Gilead. And from there he led an army against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. He said, if you give me victory over the Ammonites, I will give to the Lord whatever comes out of my house to meet me when I return in triumph. I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Now I forgot to mention this earlier. Gilead is the place in Israel that is on the east side of the Jordan River. It's associated with the tribe of Manasseh for the most part, but just a geographical part of ancient Israel. But one of the things with most of the judges is we find that they are appointed by God. God raised up this individual or raised up that individual. With Jephthah, we don't find that God actually raised him up, but we do find that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. So there is some type of anointing from God that God recognizes this person in leadership and affirms this person in leadership as well. And then Jephthah goes on and he makes a vow. Now, as the reader, we've already seen that the Spirit of the Lord has come upon Jephthah. But we do have the question of, does Jephthah even recognize that? Does he know that? Not that we're questioning his spiritual sensitivity, but is that something he was even aware of? Just because we see it in the text doesn't mean that he actually was made aware of it yet. But this vow makes no sense. Especially as we're reading it, the Spirit of the Lord is upon him. We see that he's got abilities and he's got people behind him. Why would he do this? the only real motivation that we can come up with is the fact that Jephthah was doing all he could to assure victory. So he made this vow to God. God, if you do this, I will do this over here. Right? That's a pretty bad practice to have. Because that's not how God works. That's how the pagan system works. That's how a lot of religions outside of Yahweh worked at this time. But that's not how Yahweh worked in the Old Testament. That's not how he works today. That's not how Jesus and God worked. That's not what it's like. Because otherwise it's like we can control God. We can manipulate him. God, if we give you enough of this, you'll give us what we want over here. That's what Jephthah is trying to do. He's trying to manipulate the situation to increase his odds of success. Now the vow is a little ambiguous, which we find a lot, particularly in the book of Judges. I've mentioned this at least a handful of times as we've gone through Judges, because it doesn't necessarily mean a person. It could mean whoever or whatever comes out. So it could mean an animal sacrifice. And so as we're reading this, we're like, okay, at least there's an option for something else that it could be. Because there are a lot of houses in this setting that there were 2-story houses, and the first story was kind of like the barn. The people lived upstairs, the animals lived downstairs. And so an animal could have come out as the first thing from when Jephthah returned, and that would have been fine and no problem. It would sacrifice the animal as an offering to God. But the vow is still troubling because Jephthah is trying to manipulate the situation. And we find that his daughter is the first thing to exit the home when he returns. And the story takes a real dark turn real fast. And again, we know this isn't how God works. God does not approve of human sacrifice. Why not just offer a generous offering? Why not just do that? But we see that dysfunctional decisions deliver destruction. Jephthah is a prime example of that. Because as chapter 11 continues, God gave Israel great victory. They defeated the Ammonites. They took care of the situation. There was peace, and everything was great. Until Jephthah returns home, and his only child, who was a daughter, exited the home. And she was the first thing to come out. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 31, it says, "You must not worship the Lord your God the way the other nations worship their gods. For they perform for their gods every detestable act that the Lord hates. They even burn their sons and daughters as sacrifices to their gods." Now, Deuteronomy was before the book of Judges. The people knew that this was not something God wanted. But Jephthah and the people in the book of Judges had been desensitized to violence and to sin. And so on some level, they have a very same mentality as the pagans, as those who worship other gods. But it's real easy to read stories like this and say, well, we don't do this kind of stuff, so we don't have to worry about it. Well, the issue is not the specific sin, specific problem that Jephthah encountered. The issue is that he had assimilated to the culture around him, which I think we have a real problem with that. So if we just look at this and say, well, this is human sacrifice, we don't do this anymore, we're just going to go home and have a good lunch, we're missing the point of what it means to follow Jesus today. Because there are tons of opportunities for us to be influenced by the culture. There are so many opportunities we can't even begin to count them. And so we have to make sure that we recognize, why are we doing things the way we are? Are we doing them because these ways honor God, or are we doing them because we've been influenced by the culture? And as tragic as this story with Jephthah is, like most of the book of Judges, there's a lot of ambiguity. Because it doesn't actually say he killed his daughter. He gets home and she says, hey, let me go and mourn for 2 months. She goes and mourns. And the text doesn't actually tell us that he killed her, but it does say that she died a virgin and what actually happened here. Because anybody around the situation, even if they knew the vow Jephthah had made, they'd say, you know what? Sacrificing your daughter, it's not going to do any good here. It's not going to do anything productive. But yet sometimes I think we still go ahead with it. We know that it's choices that others are making, and we allow them to make destructive choices, and we say, it is what it is, and we move on. And we don't have a community responsibility to help each other. See, the book of Judges, as I said, gets worse and worse and worse. And Jephthah is part of the third and most destructive section of the book of Judges. See, I've said many times that one of the keys to seeing where Israel is in their spiritual health in the book of Judges is to see how women are treated. At the beginning of the book, they are honored, they are revered, they are respected. And as we get further and further and further into the book, we see that women are treated very poorly. And in fact, Jephthah's daughter doesn't even have a name. Right? And we'll see that in another situation. Well, actually, we're not going to look at that. There's the way the book of Judges ends is so terrible that it's almost unfathomable. Like, this isn't even the worst story. Because that's how sinful the people were. We'll see that Judges is getting worse and worse and worse. But Jephthah's story doesn't end there. In chapter 12, it says, then the people of Ephraim mobilized an army and crossed over the Jordan River to Zaphon. They sent this message to Jephthah, why didn't you call us for help when you fought against the Ammonites? We are going to burn down your house with you in it. Jephthah replied, I summoned you at the beginning of the dispute, but you refused to come. You failed to help us in our struggle against Ammon. So when I realized you weren't coming, I risked my life and went to battle without you. And the Lord gave me victory over the Ammonites. So why have you come to fight me? The people of Ephraim responded, you men of Gilead are nothing more than fugitives from Ephraim and Manasseh. So Jephthah gathered all the men of Gilead and attacked the men of Ephraim and defeated them. Jephthah captured the shallow crossings of the Jordan River, and whenever a fugitive from Ephraim tried to go back across, the men of Gilead would challenge him. Are you a member of the tribe of Ephraim? If the man said, no, I am not, they would tell him to say Shibboleth. If he was from Ephraim, he would say Siboeth, because the people from Ephraim cannot pronounce the word correctly. Then they would take him and kill him at the shallow crossings of the Jordan. In all, 42,000 Ephraimites were killed at that time. Jephthah judged Israel for 6 years. When he died, he was buried in one of the towns of Gilead. So as I said, the story gets worse and worse and worse. So Jephthah had a confrontation with the tribe of Ephraim. If you remember, Gideon had a similar type of confrontation with Ephraim. But Ephraim, with Gideon appeased them. He appealed to their pride and kind of built them up. Jephthah didn't have the same courtesy. But Ephraim is holding a grudge, and it shows the deterioration of Israel. Because early on in the book of Judges, when there was a fight, when there was a battle, when there was a war, Ephraim stepped up. But as we get further and further and further into Judges, we see that the people aren't stepping up anymore. They're kind of taking care of themselves. They're back and hiding in their shell, and they're not coming out as they should. So when Ephraim come to Jephthah, Jephthah doesn't treat them kindly like Gideon did. He rebukes them and calls them out. And we pause for a moment and say, well, Jephthah initially tried to deal with Ammon in a very diplomatic way and try to reach a peaceable agreement. And as I think about how Jephthah handled the Ammonites and Ephraim, it makes me think of, maybe that's how we need to handle ourselves. That if I'm a follower of Jesus, the way that I associate with those who are not followers of Jesus is as peaceable as possible. Be kind to them. Give them opportunities that we can make this right. Not in a way that we compromise our faith with Jesus. But when we're talking about people who are following Jesus, we need to make sure we stand up and hold each other accountable. Hopefully we don't get to the point where it's as destructive as they were in this particular story, but the reality is that Jephthah's first priority was to defeat the Ammonites, not appease his neighbors. You know what our first priority as followers of Jesus is? Is to show the world the love and message of Jesus Christ, not make each other happy. Because I'm telling you what, I've been part of the church long enough to know that we're not going to make each other happy. Right? And we like each other still, I hope. But the reality is that's a problem. We try to appease ourselves, take care of ourselves, and forget about those out there, and then we're just our inwardly focused group. But the battle between Ephraim and Jephthah show the spiritual and relational deterioration of Israel. Because the 12 tribes of Israel were no longer one. They were all looking out for themselves, looking out for their own glory, how they can get their own. And as I think about what happened there as the Ephraimites were crossing the river and they had this test, basically there's just an H difference. It's a S sound or a sh sound at the beginning of the word. And as I was thinking about that, we have different dialects, different in our country and that type of thing. But it made me think of, you can tell someone isn't from our area if they call it Des Moines, right? Right? We're in Des Moines. And what's really confusing to me is right now Burlington is in Des Moines County, Iowa, and it's nowhere near the capital city of Des Moines, Iowa. And so that's another thing. But we have things inwardly focused that we know how to pronounce things. Because when we're inwardly focused, we can have those types of things that distinguish us. But as I think about Jephthah, his story has a lot of tragedy. God gave them peace for 6 years, which is a very short period for the book of Judges. God gave them victory over their enemies after they really came to God in a desperate way. But there was still destruction along the way because dysfunctional decisions deliver destruction. And when we allow them to happen, when we allow ourselves to be assimilated to the culture, when we allow ourselves to try to appease each other instead of expand the mission that Jesus has given us, we're going to have hard times in our lives. I think selfishness is just growing and growing and growing in the book of Judges. And if we're not careful, selfishness just permeates the church. So we want to take care of ourselves. And I'm telling you what, selfishness is a very destructive behavior, particularly if we're trying to follow Jesus. Because we can't follow Jesus and be selfish at the same time. So I don't know what's going on in your life. And we're going to sing a song. We'll have the altars open. If you want to come and pray, I want to make sure you don't miss that opportunity to pray. Because I know that whatever's going in your life, God can heal, God can redeem, God can forgive, and God can give you a new direction for your life. Because sometimes we make terrible decisions like Jephthah to make this vow to try to manipulate God. Sometimes we worship these other things that have nothing to do with God, and God says, I want to help you, but you've chosen this over here. But if we reject them, God will meet us where we are. Or maybe we're just selfish and like Ephraim, we want our own glory. I don't know where you are, but I do know we have a God that doesn't want you to miss opportunities to encounter him.